Shalom Aleichem, my dear brothers and sisters. In this video, I would like to discuss the question of why Jesus cannot be God himself, Khas v'Shalom, or any human being for that matter, or any physical object. And we see a verse in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15, and here's what it says, and I quote, "But you shall greatly beware for your souls, for you did not see any image on the day Hashem spoke to you at Horeb from the midst of the fire, lest you act corruptly and make yourselves a carved image, a likeness of any shape, a form of a male or female." So based on what the verse is saying is that Hashem says that you have not seen image of any form when Hashem spoke to you. And he says, and if you create an image of a male or a female or of any form, you are acting corruptly. This is corruption by God's definition, right? That's what the verse exactly says. Lest you act corruptly and make yourselves a carved image, a likeness of any shape, a form of a male or female. So by God's definition, creating an image of God is an act of corruption. And yet himself, God sent down a human being who was God himself. Isn't this creating an image, a form of a male, in this case, of God himself? This is an act of corruption. So basically, God tells us not to do something and tells us that this is an act of corruption, and yet he himself does it. Does this make sense? Obviously not. That's why I think it's impossible. Now I know what some of you are thinking right away, but in the book of Genesis, where it talks about that God created man in his image, right? But I'll tell you that this is, I believe, is a mistranslation. And by the way, unfortunately, sometimes you see the Jewish translations of the Torah are also mistranslating because they're using the Christian translating without, I guess, giving much thought into the translation process. But in the verses in Genesis where it talks about when God created human, and what often gets mistranslated as the image of God, and the word used over there is actually a different word in the original Hebrew than the word used in this verse that I just quoted to you in Deuteronomy. The word used over there is tselem Elohim. Now, the word should be translated over there is a likeness of God, meaning when God created humans, he created humans with a certain attribute, with certain likeness of God, not in a physical manner, because image is a physical, but so it's not. That's why I think image is a mistranslation over there. Likeness of God, meaning we as human have certain likeness, characteristic like God. For example, God has a freedom of choice. He can do as he wills. Humans, to a certain degree, have a freedom of choice and can do as they will. Right? Another maybe similarity, maybe is a better word to use over there in the verses in Genesis. Another similarity of a human and God is that humans have a self-consciousness. They are aware of their existence, and so is God aware of his existence. So therefore, that's why I think it's really important to, if you really want to understand the Torah, is to actually, there's no other shortcuts. The only way to do it is to really learn Hebrew and try to look at, sometimes the two different Hebrew words are translated into the same English word. And therefore you will never get the difference between two unless you learn it in Hebrew, and you see that there's two different Hebrew words, and then you'll look deeper and you'll try to understand why the difference. So therefore the verses in Genesis where it talks about God created humans, what it means is that God created humans in the likeness of God or similarity of God, but not, God forbid, in God's image, meaning in the physical form of God. Khas v'Shalom to even say that. Now I know what some of you again I may be thinking is that when the verse in Numbers chapter 12 verse 8 talks about where God describes Moses, like the prophecy of Moses, and here's what the verse says. Let me quote it first and then I'll explain. It says, "Mouth to mouth do I speak to him." This is God speaking, about Moses, that God speaks to Moses mouth to mouth. And then it says, in a clear vision and not in riddles. And the last part, again, sometimes gets mistranslated. And again, this mistranslation, I believe, comes from the non-Jewish sources, even though the Jewish English translations today sometimes use that and don't really, correct it. But anyways, the last part of the verse says, at the image of Hashem does he gaze. Now this is again a mistranslation. It says, Tmunat Hashem. When it says Tmunat, in this case it does really mean image. However, it doesn't mean image of Hashem. It means image by Hashem, created by Hashem. Look at the first part of the verse. It says, in clear vision and not in riddles. What is vision? Vision is a certain image, certain scenery. I don't know exactly how prophecy works, but there are certain visions that the prophets have. And then the last part of the verse where it says, at the image of Hashem, meaning the image created by Hashem. Tmunat Hashem. Image created by Hashem. Just like we have in the verses talking about, for example, the tzitzit, the fringes that the Jews are supposed to wear on the four corners of the garment. In those verses it says, mitzvot Hashem, the commandments of God. Meaning the commandments by God, made by God, or commanded by God. It doesn't mean that the commandments themselves are representing God. Right? It's the same, grammatical, it's the same form is used over there. Mitzvot Hashem, the commandments by God. That's why in English, I guess it could make sense, the commandments of God, meaning create. And here we can maybe also say that the image of God, in English, grammatically, maybe you can say that image of God, meaning the image made by God. I don't know if you can say that in English. You say, for example, the house of the president. It doesn't mean that the house is the president himself or the representation of the president. It just means the house where, that the president may be created, or where the president resides, or the president owns, right? So that's why I got to be really careful. And I think the real way to really understand, or to at least try to even understand, is to learn Hebrew. Try to learn Hebrew and learn it in the original. Without knowing Hebrew, the problem is you cannot even try to understand the verses. Because you see two verses, you see two identical words. It says image here, it says image here. And you have no idea that actually these are two different words in Hebrew. And so I hope this answers maybe some of the questions you may have. Thank you for watching.